All right, so welcome everybody. We can start with the general housekeeping and introductions as people come in. So good afternoon. My name is Rola Ajjawi. I'm a professor at CRADLE at Deakin University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here for this book launch. This was a book that was maybe a couple of years in gestation. I will talk a little bit about that, but just to start with, I will hopefully get my computer to go. So this is the book we're going to be talking about: Assessment for Inclusion in Higher Education, Promoting Equity and Social Justice in Assessment. Myself, Professor David Boud, and Dr. Joanna, and with sincere apologies from Trina, Jorre, who is right now in the process of relocating states, so is otherwise very busy. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, the custodians of the land on which I'm located. On behalf of us all, I pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional custodians, elders and ancestors of all the lands from which you may be joining our gathering today. I express our gratitude for their care of country, which continues to sustain us as it has done for millennia. Education has a long and rich heritage on this continent, which we aim to honour and reflect in the ways we teach and learn. I encourage you to add in the country you're joining us from into the chat, if you wouldn't mind. So this is our esteemed panel for today. It's such a pleasure when we thought about who we'd like to be there for this book launch. Alfred Deakin Professor Liz Johnson, DBCA for Deakin University, and of course Professor Sally Kift, who doesn't need any introductions and led the amazing work on transitional pedagogies, and chair of the Teaching and Fellowship Awards, were the people we thought of, and it's so great to have them here. And as I mentioned, we'll also, the editors, Trina, are here to also chat with you about the book. So the way this is going to be structured is I'm going to pass on to Liz shortly to really talk a little bit about what this, the context in which we find ourselves in, and then move on to Sally, who's also going to talk for about 10 minutes about inclusion and assessment for inclusion. And then we're going to move on to each of us, myself, then Dave, then Joe, who are going to present really the top key messages, if you like, the really takeaways from the book that, around the sections that they've worked on and what they think matters in terms of, doing this well. And just before I hand over to Liz, I'm just going to orientate you a little bit to what we mean by when we say assessment for inclusion. I think this is really the premise of what we tried to achieve in the book, is that assessment should ensure that no student is advantaged or disadvantaged by virtue of features other than their ability to meet appropriate and necessary standards. So it's really about thinking through, if we foreground equity as the lens for assessment design, what would that look like and how could that promote social justice for all of our students? So with that, I will hand over to you, Liz. Thank you.
Thank you, Rola, and what an enormous pleasure it is to be here today with your colleagues to launch another in this wonderful series from CRADLE, which is really leading thinking around higher education, not just here in Australia, but internationally. When Rola approached me to speak to you today, I was thinking about the sector because we are in the year of the University Accord. Many of you will be either participating in or following the work of the University Accord Review Panel, which is at the moment gathering submissions from across the sector. And part of that emphasis follows the very keen interest that our current Minister, Jason Clare, has for inclusion and equity in higher education, in fact, across the whole education system. Minister Clare himself has said on a number of occasions just how powerful a force inclusion can be in enriching Australia, not just in terms of what students study, but also in terms of society and the economic zone as well. So equity and inclusion is very much on the minds of Australian higher education providers and the government, which is a very good thing, because we are looking at the transition over the last few decades of higher education from elite education to mass education. Many of you will recall or be familiar with the provisions of the CRADLE review, which came out in 2008 and set us a target of 40% participation by 2020 for 29 to 34-year-olds. We've achieved that target. Australia has achieved that target. But at the time, Denise Bradley's panel also set a target of 20% participation from low SES learners. We have not met that target. And in fact, we don't meet it for equity cohorts more broadly. We have work to do. And to do good work in this space, we really must understand what we're dealing with and understand where innovation and data and research is leading us. We've got to understand the barriers and the opportunities that are available for people from all walks of life. I was giving a talk last week on International Women's Day to some colleagues and talking about intersectionality, where multiple factors come together to affect how people engage with education. And by the time I'd finished my long list of things which could be barriers to participating successfully in education, I stood back a little and looked at it and I said, well, I think that's just about everyone. By the time you add in economic background, social capital, as in economic capital and also social supports, disability, age, caring responsibilities, work responsibilities, the list goes on, and cultural background. By the time you add all that together, that's most of us. So inclusive practice really applies to most of us, and we have an opportunity this year to make it the topic of national conversation around higher education. So I think this book is hitting the mark in a moment that really needs it. Deakin University has a particular mission around equity and access, and it was founded on the idea of regional and remote access to higher education. And we do welcome diverse learners. 40% of our undergraduate students are non-school leavers, and they span from people who are returning to study after work or from care responsibilities or from other commitments, all sorts of people coming back to study. And they bring with them their individual and unique backgrounds. A lot of our students who are combining study with caring responsibilities or work need inclusive practice. They often choose to study with us online. They often choose to study part-time. Most of our students are studying alongside are working alongside study. That means they're juggling many things at once. And so inclusive practice overall is one of the really important things that we can apply to their learning experience to make them more able to succeed. The CRADLE team have tackled a number of really critical issues in how we design and deliver learning and teaching in higher education. CRADLE itself was established in 2015. We were having a little discussion earlier about what would we say was the launch date, because the team assembled over a little period of time. But it's become a national and international leader in educational research and in higher educational research. And I particularly want to call out recent recognitions of both Boud and Rola Ajjawi, both editors on this particular book, recent recognitions of them. And that means that we've got a big audience to talk to and a big responsibility to carry the conversation forward. And this, as I say, is another step in that journey of having an international conversation around key topics in assessment and feedback. The final thing I really want to say to you is a little bit about the book itself. I think it's very exciting to have these kinds of collections come together because they draw on thinking both locally and internationally. And that international flavour really helps us to understand what things look like from very diverse perspectives. in a novel, in a book that's on inclusion, assessment on inclusion, this is particularly gratifying to see. We're seeing not just diversity within Australia, but diversity across the world contributing to this book, and expertise across the world contributing to the book. I'd like to congratulate our editors, Rola Ajjawi, Dave Boud, Joanna and Trina Jorre, all close colleagues and friends, for their work in gathering this together. And I haven't read the whole book yet, but I have read the first chapter, and I'm really looking forward to a deep dive into the rest of the book. I know it will help me to formulate policy and process and good practice at Deakin, and I'm sure it will do likewise for universities around the world. Thank you, Rola. It's a delight to be here.
Oh, thank you, Liz. Thanks for putting the book into a bigger context of what's happening in Australia in the higher education sector, but like you said, also internationally as well. It's the diversification of the student body, while at the same time not meeting particular targets, but as you say, all of us bring in these intersectional identities that interplay at the same time with assessment and assessment practices. And not only that, actually, for the ones who make it into higher education, we also have to support them to attain at similar levels. And we do have that issue of differential attainment for students graduating from universities as well, which supports us in thinking about, which makes the pointy end of assessment even more important to think about. Thanks, Liz. Professor Sally Kift, I'm going to hand over to you.
All right, thanks, Rola, and thanks everyone, and thanks CRADLE for the invitation to speak with you all here today. Like Liz, I'm absolutely delighted. What a book, and what a way to launch it. So thank you, and thank you particularly, I think, for making the book open access. That's very inclusive and equitable, if you don't mind my saying. So I understand my role today is essentially equity scene setting, and what a scene it is to set and a time to be setting it. I'm going to pick up on some of the points that Liz made. I've been frantically crossing out as she went through, so that's probably a good thing. And inclusion for me, I think in this context, is also about the humanising and compassionate responses that are probably required in assessment, which, as Rola's just said, is very much the pointy end of the student experience. It seems to me that assessment and equity for inclusion have been inextricably interlinked, but just hasn't received the attention that it deserves to date. Equity, inclusion and widening participation in higher education have been a focus of national and international attention for decades, but they've been the subject, I think, of particular and substantive refocus in these disrupted times as world economies come to realise that national fairness and prosperity go hand in hand. It's all about the best chance for all, as Matt Brett and Nadine Zacharias has said, that advancing Australia's future depends on all of its people, whoever and wherever they are, being enabled to engage successfully in beneficial and lifelong learning. All people, even university students, perhaps. I do realise that I'm speaking with an international audience, but please forgive me if I take, as Liz did, a bit of an Australian slant on the equity project, much of which I hope will resonate internationally. Australia has a proud history of promoting equity in higher education. In fact, it's the first objective set out in the Higher Education Support Act about the university mission is to support a higher education system that is characterised by quality, diversity and equity of access. We started back in the 1990s with an equity policy framework, Lynn Martin's A Fair Chance for All, that identified the 6 designated equity groups. And over time, we've been tracking progress of those equity groups. Now, it is the case, as Liz mentioned, that the CRADLE reforms improved our higher education equity remit substantially, particularly by uncapping student enrolments under the demand-driven system and providing dedicated equity funding for widening participation. And that saw increases in equity group participation across all of the 6 equity groups. But as we know, and Vincent Tinto so eloquently captured, access without support is not opportunity. And we might add, nor does access deliver equitable opportunity if it's weighed down by impenetrable, inequitable assessment practices. The hard-fought gains in access to higher education have not automatically translated to increased retention and success for equity populations, and we still struggle to shift the dial on attrition, success, retention and graduate outcomes for equity groups for many complex reasons that are as complex as the life loads and the lived higher education experience of equity-bearing cohorts. I think we're really talking about entrenched exclusion still at the moment. So the point here is that I think also there's a difference between, and I think Trina, Jorre and David Boud made this point in their chapter particularly, there is a difference between equality and equity in assessment. The notion that fairness requires sameness and equal treatment in assessment policies and practices to automatically tick the equity inclusion box. As Trina and David said, current assessment practices really treat students, and I would add to that disciplines, as almost entirely homogeneous, when the reality is very different. And even if equality and equity were interchangeable, and they're not, as this audience I think is particularly aware, it's the case now that in Australia, approximately 50% of domestic undergraduates belong to at least one equity group, with many belonging to at least two or more, and thus experiencing multiple disadvantaging factors. In fact, the Institute for Social Science Research at the University of Queensland found in 2020 that there's a growing number of students who experience such cumulative disadvantage, 1 in 10 students now in Australian higher education. So my point here is that student populations are becoming more and more diverse in our massified system, so less homogeneous, less glossy marketing brochure pics of privileged, typical traditional students who are young, full-time, have the luxury of time and aren't juggling complicated life load. Diversity in cohorts is a dominant feature of our massified sector, and that demographic reality alone would seem to demand a concerted embrace of universal design principles broadly and more inclusive assessment principles specifically. And the complexity is compounded by other groups who are equity-like, though not formally recognised. For example, and I know the UK has great experience of this, students who have been in care. In the US, they talk about veteran students. We've explored through a variety of mechanisms the equity needs of both of those cohorts of students, but also students who are parents and carers, rainbow students, mature age students. In 2022, the Productivity Commission even pointed to other cohorts who needed support, particularly first in family students, who now number 51% still of students entering higher education. Part-time students, the Productivity Commission referred to, those numbers are increasing. They're about 35% of our cohorts now, and online students, who of course have been growing exponentially. So this, as Crawford and her colleagues in the book note, this isn't about further stereotyping types of students, but rather highlights diversity and acknowledges that students have complex identities that can impact their experience of assessment. The timeliness of the work, as Liz has already mentioned, could not be better judged or more prescient. COVID forced a bit of a cut through, I think, on some of the intransigent inertia that's been systemically stymieing assessment's evolution. There have been some real advances over the COVID years, both procedurally and substantively, to accommodate learners' freshly disadvantaged circumstances and the exacerbation of pre-existing disadvantage for many others. Equity advocates have long argued that learners' complicated life circumstances should be legitimately taken into account for grading, assessment and broader purposes, but to no avail. And I know Sarah Lambert had a wonderful Google document up at one stage that saw and recorded the compassionate flexibility that freed up special consideration, submission deadlines, grading, deferral and withdrawal requirements from an equity rather than everybody's treated the same equality perspective. And that was a huge advance, as was inclusive design's availability of accessible formats in the learning management system. So I think we need to assess the levelling up benefits of all those sort of more procedural aspects as well, and think about how they might be now more mainstreamed accommodations. Yes, I see you smiling there, Sarah Lambert, in the chat, because many of them have now been withdrawn. And of course, we've got the counterbalance that with the inflexibility around visceral and technological response to assessment integrity and assessment security and artificial intelligence. On this happy day when ChatGPT-4 version 4 has been released, which apparently 90% of has a 90% success rate on the American bar exam. So, you know, I think we're all out of a job potentially. A little bit more on the timeless is about the Accord, I think, and the Accord is to drive lasting and transformative reform in Australian higher education. The Accord process has a specific term of reference on greater access and participation for students from underrepresented backgrounds. And given the observations in this book that assessment for inclusion and universal design for inclusive learning and teaching more broadly is really at the margins of HE higher education core business, it suggests that we might need to draw the attention of the outcomes of this book to the Accord panel. The chair of the Accord panel, Mary O'Kane, asked for bold ideas and more focus on learning and teaching. That sounds like an invitation too good to refuse for us. And we might say, for example, as Brett and Harvey record in their chapter, that even though the Higher Education Standards Framework in Australia does have a specific standard around diversity and equity that talks about teaching and learning approaches that are designed to accommodate and create equal opportunities for academic success regardless of student backgrounds, and makes specific reference to participation and completion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, the equity imperative for inclusion is not otherwise enshrined in the regulatory framework, except I would say, quite immodestly, in standard 1.3 orientation and progression, which was influenced, and thank you for mentioning it, colleagues, influenced by transition pedagogy, because it suggests that standard 2B says there's a need to undertake early assessment to provide formative feedback on academic progress and identify needs for additional support. And that was all about helping students understand what's required and then unpacking for them the assessment and feedback literacies that sort of otherwise cover up the hidden rules of how it is to play the higher education assessment game. So the big takeaway from all of this for me really is that it's taken us so long to direct mainstream attention to assessment role in mediating diverse students' lived experience of learning engagement as they transition in, through and out of higher education, given, from the words of the wise, that students really, excuse me, can't escape bad assessment practice. And worse, we've got robust evidence now that inaction on assessment quality and inclusion impacts a student's sense of belonging and, unsurprisingly, their sense of mental health and wellbeing. And I know Rola's done work on this, and as have Walker Gibbs and others, colleagues. First-year students, for example, use their first experiences of assessment to calibrate their expectations, their own performance, their suitability for higher education. If they're making those harsh judgments on the basis of non-inclusive assessment design, then that's a national tragedy. The book is the product of a combined international think tank, the outcomes of a cogent coalition of the assessment willing, and I thank them for it. It really is assessment next generation thinking. It should and does make us uncomfortable about preserving such a patently inadequate status quo, and demands comprehensive and urgent action. We might even encourage the Universities Accord panel to provide further research and development funding for learning and teaching to enhance and further entrench the outcomes of the book. As the book extorts, working with our Gentic students as partners to access and embed more diverse student voices is key. It came from the disability sector, nothing about us without us. And I think it sounds very fine in this context. So the big challenge, I think, is to get all educators, in which I include professional staff, especially those working in the third space, all senior managers, all disciplines and their professional accrediting bodies, and all regulators to think differently about assessment. If I could just conclude with this rather nice piece from Albert Chan, who's a US diversity, equity and inclusion advocate, because I got all these words running around in my head. He says, diversity is a fact, equity is a choice, inclusion is an action, belonging is an outcome. I think we could do worse than abide by that. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you so much, Sally. That was wonderful. it's a really important reminder of how assessment is political and how we need to get political to actually make it really equitable and make it front and centre for funding, for the accord, for missions in the university. Folks, please put in any questions you have for Liz and Sally. Please use the Q&A. What we're going to do now is move into the second part where each of the editors here today will give a brief summary of their key messages from the book and in regards to the sections that they edited. And I'm going to start that process by actually taking you through a really quick whistle-stop tour of what the book looks like. And I should have said my one message at the beginning was that we will, once the three of us are done, we will be taking Q&A. We'll officially close at 5 o'clock, and then we will take further questions if there are any. So let me just share my screen again. So like Sally said already, this was an international, a book brought together with international voices, Coalition of the Willing, I think you called it, Sally. And it came about by a lot of work on various fronts. So there was obviously the sustained scholarship that Dave has led and CRADLE has led around assessment design, feedback and academic integrity. There was a big project funded by NESHI that was in collaboration with Central Queensland University that was led by Joe Tai around the exams and how exams marginalise and exclude students with disabilities. A number of projects led by Molly and Joe as well around students as partners research. And that coalesced into an international symposium with the word international there twice, with speakers held in October 2021 that we hosted virtually, and that led to this book. And like Sally has mentioned already, it is open access. This is what it looks like, and actually I've got one here as well, and the QR code should hopefully take you to the link where you can read it online. It's made up of 3 sections. Broadly speaking, there's a macro section looking at societal and cultural perspectives. This one brings together lots of theory that aims to critique how our fundamental assumptions of assessment need to change. The notion, for example, that time is linear and equal for all of us. The idea that ableism and meritocracy underpins assessment such that it's so individualized in practice that if a student, say, underperforms, it's perceived like it's the fault of the student without a broader look at what else is happening or going on, and then the students internalize that as a deficit perspective that they have. So they are themselves in deficit. And we've got a lovely chapter in here as well on Indigenous perspectives and different ways of knowing. And the thing that assessment for inclusion comes at is that, yes, we need to support students to overcome barriers and to learn the rules of the game, but I think in parallel we need to work to remove the barriers as well. And that's where new ways of knowing, that Indigenous ways of knowing come in, that maybe reinscribe the rules of the game for us. At meso levels, we have institutional and community perspectives. We've got beautiful policy analysis by Brett. We've got a chapter on AI and a chapter by Phil that tackles head on the idea that cheating is a problem if we move to an assessment for inclusion model. And in fact, he argues that if we exclude students, then we are compromising the validity of the assessment by doing that. And in the third section, we move towards the micro context. So here, what do educators, students, and the relationship between the educators and the students need to do to make assessment more inclusive. So that's a big picture view of what the book tries to tackle. And as I said at the beginning, the key premise really is that assessment should not disadvantage students because of characteristics or abilities extraneous to the outcomes being judged, such that values of equity and social justice undergird assessment practices throughout. But what does that mean? And you've just heard from Sally and Liz about the changing, the diversity in our student body. And I draw here from this quote from Jan MacArthur, who's really seminal in the work around assessment for social justice, that assessment isn't just about the individual, but about how they become their position in relation to society and what they can contribute to society and the discipline at large. So inclusion within the university isn't just about categories of people or labels, but about the full realization of everyone within the university as both an individual and a social being. And I think that's what we're getting at here, is if we improve assessment for everyone, then it benefits everyone. And what Jan in particular talks about is we need to rethink assessment design so that students are actually building the relationship with community and understanding their social themselves within that. So what are we aiming for with inclusive assessment? This is exactly, I think, the point that Sally was getting at. You know, we sometimes, and actually I was having this conversation with Margaret today, when you say, well, what about if we make things different? And they say, and, you know, practitioners might say, well, is that fair? And what is fair trying to get at here? And perhaps fair is conflated with equity, but really what we mean is it equal, when we should be saying, is it equitable? And with equity, then we create supports that overcome disadvantage. With that final liberation, we actually remove the barriers. We change the way we do things in assessment, not just support students, for example, through mentorship or feedback to do the game as we've set it out. So what happens in assessment at the moment? Well, like we said, there's legal requirements for students with disabilities specifically. In one of the chapters by Matt Brett and Andrew Harvey that Sally referenced, they did a policy analysis and showed that actually this idea that inclusion is regulated through assessment doesn't flow through to assessment policies in the institution and even in the practices in the units of study themselves. So there's some policy work to be done there. The next step is that we move to an accommodations and adjustments model. So we ask you as an individual, what do you need for you to be able to do this assessment in an equitable way? But what happens is it adds burden to staff and students, and it can lead to othering. So for example, the classic example is that, and actually it works on the periphery of assessment design. So what do I mean by that? We say, okay, so you can have more time, or you can have more breaks, or you can do your assessment in a separate room. But all of these individualized approaches are not actually changing the assessment itself, but creating this student as a special other that needs to do it differently. Special considerations, they're on the rise as well. And Yusa Menon, who I think is in the crowd, has written beautiful work around the problem with this in terms of how it focuses on the individual, doesn't remove the barriers. There's also disability access plans. Again, I mean, I'm not saying we don't need these things. I think they are important, but we need more tools in our toolbox. And finally, universal assessment for design for assessment is another tool that is existing out there. Joe and I worked on a critical, and Anastasia Umarova worked on a critical review of the literature. And whilst universal design of assessment, their principles are out there and builds on universal design of learning, it isn't really very common in the practices out there in our universities. And in fact, we found very few studies that looked at the impact. So where are the gaps? And there's many, there's systematic gaps around the systematic evaluation of inclusion. There's a lack of aligned policies that put equity first, lack of choice in assessment, and we don't put equity first in assessment design. So these are the principles we land on in the final chapter. And I noticed the time, I've been talking a bit too much. Jo is going to talk about that first one, about how we bring students in to really be partners in assessment design, that inclusion becomes more of a mainstay of regulatory frameworks. They're in policy documents, they inform evaluation. We gather data on how students perceive the assessment and their experiences, that teachers need to adopt ethical reflexivity in terms of the monitoring of all the processes around assessment and putting equity first, and that we need more diverse discourses to be embedded to disrupt our current perceptions of assessment design. But that's the last chapter if you want to flip through that. Dave, I'm going to hand over to you, and apologies for going over my time. That's your slide there.
Oh, thanks very much, Rola. And thanks for the very good setup from Liz and Sally. I think we're at an interesting point, and that there's a danger that we have that this discussion about assessment for inclusion gets taken up by people that see themselves as equity specialists or people that have a commitment to social justice and so on. And I'd like to suggest, and it's manifest in many of the chapters in the book, that it's something that we all need to be concerned about. And I'd like to identify 3 reasons here, which again are spelt out in various ways in the book. I mean, the first one focuses on, are we letting many of our vulnerable students down? And this is something that touches every single one of us who teaches in university. So our assessment practices right now, as Rola portrayed in that wonderful cartoon with people standing on boxes, there are negative and discriminatory effects on students who cannot demonstrate what they can do because the way we've organised assessment at the moment does not allow it. So they could meet the outcomes of our courses, but the way we set up the tasks, the way we set up the assessment processes just gets in the way. So that is about every one of us taking responsibility for ensuring that all of our students can demonstrate effectively what they can do. So we need to move towards ending accommodations, ending the need for adjustments, ending the need for students to put their hand up and maybe embarrass themselves by declaring that they have, in their eyes, some deficiency, and organise things in such a way that that whole range of people can be accommodated without going into pacification, special processes, administrative organisational extras. So that is about doing the right thing by our students right now. So that really is about, are we letting our students down? The second one is, are we letting ourselves down? We professionals in the teaching, learning and assessment business, all of us who teach in higher education are. We might not identify that way, but if we don't enable all of our students who could meet our requirements to do so, because there's something about our practices which are getting in the way, it shows us up to be unprofessional. It shows our assessments to be invalid and inequitable. And this just makes us look stupid, wouldn't it, frankly? And the more there's discussion about these issues, the worse it will get. So we don't want university lecturers to be singled out for being pretty deficient kind of characters just because they're unaware of some of the inadvertent effects of what they do right now. And thirdly, the focus there is on, are we letting society down? So in addition to the effects that our assessment might have on individual students and on whether they can demonstrate what they can do, it can also inadvertently undermine principles of social justice and privilege students from some backgrounds, some positions, some perspectives over others. Students that have a lot of social capital, students that have a lot of cultural capital, students have a lot of appropriate capital, are grossly favoured in the way we organise things just now. So it's about not just doing the right thing by our students and ourselves, but doing the right things in terms of social justice. And I think we can talk as if the book means you've got to buy the whole package or not at all in terms of assessment for inclusion. But I see that we can chip away and make things progressively better by doing a whole range of little things on the way. It doesn't mean that we need to take a strong position on social justice. We can start by saying, am I being fair to my students right now? And if the answer is, well, maybe I'm not, then we've just got to do something about that right now. And as our awareness spreads, and as reading this book will enable people to do, their awareness of a wider range of issues comes about, then we can start to tackle those. But let's not delay the start of making a change by having to do everything right now. Because if we try to do everything right now, it'll just trip us up. So let's make a really productive start. So these are the kind of things that we talk about in the first part of the book. And in fact, they pop up throughout. There's other important things in that first section about what can critical disability studies offer for assessment for inclusion, what are some Indigenous perspectives on this issue, and what can perspectives that come from the framework of decolonisation of the curriculum offer us in this area. And of course, there are other things. So in the Q&A, we're not going to be able to answer all the questions that are referred to in the book, because what we want to do is we want you to buy the book. And it's not only available online, you can actually get it in a hardback copy, which I have in my hand. A hardback and a paperback copy is the paperback I have in my hand here. So I'll pass on for the rest of the book to Jo.
Thanks, Dave. And yes, I did put the link to the actual book to purchase in the chat, not asking you to buy the book yourself, but perhaps for your institution to purchase a copy or two so that other people can have it in their hands as well. And it is, of course, available online for free. So even if you don't want to buy it, please read it. And I thought, everyone else has really talked about the principles, and I thought I would share a few little tasters from the subsequent sections of the book, just to perhaps pique your interest a little further. In the second section, the meso section on institutional and community perspectives, there are a range of chapters which discuss the structures and constructions within the higher education setting that have determined in the past who is included and what's considered appropriate within assessment, and whose values and whose ways of doing things have counted in the past. Some authors draw out examples for particular groups of students. For example, Dave and Trina talk about low socioeconomic students, and Tan Pham also talks about international students and how they've been positioned in relation to assessments. And really, these chapters really ask us to think about, well, what's happened in the past, and is this correct? However, given the flavour of the year is ChatGPT, I thought I'd also like to draw your attention to the chapter by Brett Stevenson and Andrew Harvey, because they talk about the age of AI-enabled assessment and really point to some really important issues around the potential for inequity to arise from the use of AI, from algorithmic biases, from the ways that AI is generally constructed and the ways that other people have already adopted AI within higher education settings. And one of the things they really point to is the need for humans in the loop. And I think we can all be those humans in the loop, being the ones to, put that dampener on perhaps what AI is thinking about making decisions and making decisions based on unfair algorithms, and to actually be those people who go, hang on a minute, this isn't right. We could do something different. And I think Rola also mentioned Phil Dawson's chapter around assessment security and validity. And his example also speaks back to those broader concerns about, really how useful is any type of assessment if certain groups of people are excluded or disadvantaged unintentionally. So there are things that are unintentional that are already happening, and we could all be a little bit more mindful of what we could do to reverse some of those unintentional things. So I'll now move on to the final section of the book, which is the micro section, looking at student, educator and interpersonal perspectives. And if you haven't had a look already, in this section, there are a lot of details about how things could be done. There are a lot of exemplars of different ways in which people have already done some things towards inclusion and to bridge some of those gaps that everyone else has mentioned already. And I think across all of those chapters, we see it's important really to talk and to discuss and to muddle through with the people who are actually involved and impacted, i.e. students and staff and everyone else who might somehow come into the assessment machine. So what this ends up doing is that, the conversations must happen in a way that do not predetermine the outcomes of what these conversations might be. So, reframing success, rethinking about what matters most for students within particular groups, and reconsidering how students might better tackle assessment. And I know another probably quite common thing now is talk of students as partners. And I know a lot of people have already done work in this place, but assessment has, I think, up until now been one of the things that was a little bit harder to tackle in terms of involving students as partners. But we have a number of chapters that really do actually involve students meaningfully and come to, I wouldn't say entire solutions, but come to new practices and different strategies which actually have made meaningful change for students. And I think it really shows that we can actually achieve more inclusive assessment. So it's not a imaginary far off thing, it is a thing that has happened. So yeah, I think the book overall really has demonstrated that, there's a lot of things that have happened in the past that has led to where we are now, but it is possible to change the way we do things. And I really invite you all to come along, have a dip into whatever bit of the book takes your fancy and to see and get some ideas about how we can all work with others to make meaningful actions towards assessment for inclusion.
Thank you so much, Jo. I feel like we're teasing you with some of the problems, but not really offering too many solutions. I don't know that there are, but we certainly suggest in the book, like Jo was saying, there are particular ways of operating that might, and there's certainly case studies in the book that show pockets of good assessment for inclusion. Jo mentioned that, we see change, and actually that brings me to the first question in the Q&A, which I'd like to pose to you, Sally and Liz, while we've got you here. And Margaret says, I find the aspirations of assessment for inclusion inspiring, but as someone who has studied the challenges of changing assessment practices, I wonder whether you think what you think are the priority practical steps at an institutional or governance level for affecting change around assessment for inclusion.
You want to have a go, Sally?
You're the current DVC, Liz, so I think you're best placed.
Look, it's a good question, and because it's often with a big and daunting task, the temptation is to tinker at the edges. And that's not sustainable from anybody's point of view. There will always be great champions who do brilliant work. Step number one is to get their work out, which is exactly what this book is doing. But step number two, I think it's actually to look to reflect on the way the book is organised. So what it's actually suggesting is that you need to operate at multiple levels in tandem. So you're pulling a leadership aspiration alongside enabling environments, alongside the innovative work of individuals and disciplines. And I honestly think that if you want to create sustainable curriculum change, you have to do it at multiple levels at once. I was thinking, what would I actually do to help if I was doing this at Deakin? And I reflect on what happened over the pandemic. universities worldwide were able to change really quickly. We all know that the changes weren't necessarily as well considered or as sustainable as we would like them to be. We're familiar with the idea of emergency remote teaching. But that was a stepping stone, and I hope it is seen as a stepping stone to really important change in practice. If you'd asked me 5 years ago if I could stop my university from running exam hall exams, I would have said, well, that's going to take a long time. In reality, it took 1 year. And because we were in a crisis and all layers of the university worked together to do it. Now, that's not a, we will adjust that situation as we go on. But I think we really need to work collectively at all levels of the university to make space for change, to celebrate those people that are doing good work and to listen. I think the principle around listening to students and staff, for that matter, about what works and what doesn't work is the one which will actually make change fastest, because it works at multiple levels.
The only thing that I would add to that, apart from endorsing it, of course, is to say that was why I threw out the challenge at the end. I think senior leaders need to be on board with this. I think if we can change the dynamics in the higher education standards framework. I know that's a regulatory response, but as Matt and Andrew Harvey say in their chapter, I mean, this shouldn't be relegated to the fact that it's not mentioned in the higher education standards framework under learning outcomes and assessment and course design, for example, would seem to be slightly problematic. So, I think, it's the macro, meso, micro level. Early adopters, so trialling in disciplines where, you've got agents for change that are willing to do it. And I see Tim Fawn's in the chat there. I'm very much taken, because transition pedagogy would suggest also this is having everyone around the table so that it's not one person's responsibility. It's a joint responsibility, including with students, seems to make enormous sense.
Thank you, Sally and Liz. I like the detrenching, Margaret. I'm not sure that we can adopt that as an orientation. And Liz, you made me reflect on actually what the pandemic, the shift away from the exam halls, and the research that Jo led really showed that actually by moving assessment out of these exam halls, it became more inclusive because people could use their devices in their own setups, and it allowed different notions of time and for doing the assessment as well, and less travel and all of that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Rola, because it is a really interesting example. Yes, that happened. But then we had introduced new disadvantage because people couldn't get access to networks. So the critical importance of listening to stakeholders, students, staff, professional staff supporting all the time is really, really important. We won't make sustainable change if we don't listen.
I do think, it's because there's so many, because of the diversity issue, that ability to have choice as well and flexibility does come into it then, and how that plays out for different students is really important. I'm not sure whether to take this next question now or whether to officially close. I mean, and then to really unpack it. Tim, my quick answer to you would be, I do think we need different theoretical frameworks for assessment. I think that we do need to take different epistemological moves, and I know that you and Margaret have been having this chat in the chat about do you do it without actually this wholesale change, or do you do it with the change? But I think what I'll do is I will do an official close if there aren't any more questions on the Q&A, and then maybe we can continue the chat amongst us, because we are a smaller group. So with that, what I will say is have a look, find the book online. It is open access. We haven't managed to cover all the chapters. There are many more in the book that we haven't really addressed in this chat. And it, there probably are more gaps as well. It's really just the beginning of an exploration into what if we wanted to put equity first in assessment design, what would that look like and what do we need to do? And actually on theme, what I want to say is that, yes, and Trina in absentia, and Trina, we've missed you, and I hope the move is going well. Apologies for the bad timing for you. Actually, our next seminar is April 5th at 2 p.m. and it's continuing on the theme, and it's with Dr. Yuso Naimanen from the Faculty of Education, the University of Hong Kong. It's looking at assessment and student identity formation, becoming a disabled student through assessment. So it's about how disability can be is constituted through our assessment practices. So please do join us for that. If you do need to leave, thank you so much for coming. Liz and Sally, thank you so much for being part of our book launch. It's been excellent. Really, you know, I'm going to go back and listen because I think there's lots of really important messages in there about positioning, how we position this, and how we politically perhaps influence the conversation. So thank you so much, and thank you to all of you on the chat. But please stay on if you have time and you have more questions. We are here, the editors are here to answer them. So who wants to take on Tim's question? Dave, you want to say something? Go for it.
Well, can I start? Because I think there's kind of a whole lot of different angles on this question. I think one of the things that Tim's getting at here is, are we going to frighten off anyone that has a more objective view of assessment from engaging with the whole business? And I think the answer is no, because there's an awful lot we can do for people that still maintain that position. What we're not saying is that students do not have to meet certain standards. We're not saying that students don't have to meet certain criteria. Of course they do. The question is, have we set appropriately what those standards and criteria are in a way that allows all students to meet those requirements? And of course, there's a view of us in the discipline, and there's a view of people in professional bodies that might accredit. So what we're suggesting at one level here is that students can show that they can meet these outcomes in different ways. We're not changing any of the fundamentals of assessment. We're also building, again, on a very fundamental principle of assessment, and that is validity. Do our assessments actually do what they say on the tin? Like, our assessments are there in order to assure whether learning outcomes have been met or not, and have they been met at the threshold. And there's absolutely no reason in any kind of principles of assessment that it's necessary for every student to demonstrate that they've met those outcomes and met those particular criteria in the same way. Now, there's a whole lot of practical issues about how you adjust and calibrate students who demonstrate their meeting of the outcomes in different modes and in different manners, and so on and so forth. But that, I think, is essentially a technical question. It's not an epistemological question.
And I think perhaps pragmatically, many of those concerns around, but this other older version of assessment is the only objective way, is really more to do with our own worries and concerns and frustrations around budget, around having to design new assessments, about having to rethink about something that we've just done previously and not have to put in too much time or effort. I mean, I do acknowledge that changing things does take time, it does take thinking, does take negotiation with a whole bunch of people. And I think we have to also remember that, for the students who have a disability, who have legal rights to accommodations, that they spend a lot of their time negotiating, trying to work out what works for them, attending an assessment, an exam, and finding out that actually it's not accessible to them and they do a terrible job. And we have to think about the workload implications, not just for us, but for our students who we would hope are focusing on learning, but may not have the opportunity if they're spending all their time running around doing logistical management of how am I going to complete my assessment. So I think that sort of pragmatic side of things also comes in, but it's not just about us as academics, it's about the people we are also teaching.
Liz?
Can I jump in? Because I think the mechanics of the cost of the mechanics of large-scale assessment are underestimated. So when you think about what it costs to run special consideration and all those adjustments that are well covered, discussed in the book and Rola pointed to before, when you talk about the cost of doing that, there's a lot of hidden cost sitting in the back of assessment. When we moved our assessment online, the cost of running exam hall exams became very clear to us. What did it actually cost to do that, to create an artificial environment, which, by the way, doesn't necessarily, I mean, getting to Dave's point about validity, doesn't necessarily test what people think it might. We're spending a great deal of money doing that. So the question is how could we repurpose that money so it was spent on assessment that actually was looking at the kind of things, the learning outcomes that we're really seeking? And I do think it comes back when people talk about objectivity, what are you really measuring? It worries me that we create assessment and then assume that because we've either got it or had it or used it ourselves, that somehow there's validity in history. I'm yet to be persuaded.
Thanks, Liz. And actually, we have a question that kind of follows on nicely around what you're saying is from you. So might you have further thoughts on the inclusion and exclusion when it comes to setting standards? For example, it's a commonly stated argument in academic literature that not all people with disabilities can become pilots or doctors. How do you think about academic standards more inclusively? And I think that's what Tim was coming at with learning outcomes, is do we then need different outcomes? Dave, do you want to say? I think you've just typed something in, but...
No, I do have something to say about this. Yes, I don't think we should be graduating pilots that can't see, for example, if we have planes that are only designed in such a way that they could be flown by people with sight. So there are some features of society that we need to kind of acknowledge. But I go back to an example that I experienced more than 20 years ago now. I had a profoundly deaf student in a master's class in another university. And he had been excluded from undergraduate teacher training programs because he was deaf, and that he couldn't go into a normal school and teach a normal lesson because that course had been accredited by the State Education Department and they had certain inflexible requirements. Now, of course, he actually didn't want to teach normal students in a normal classroom. He actually wanted to teach deaf people in a school. Right? So he was barred from a qualification that he was entirely suitable for because there was a mismatch between different kinds of requirements. The irony, of course, that when I met him, he was the principal of an adult education college that addressed people that were deaf and not deaf, and he was doing fantastically well, thank you very much. So I think we need to discriminate in terms of course, we need to exclude. I mean, we've got this nice, warm, fuzzy feeling that we need to bring everyone in. That is not possible. There are certain inflexible and immovable requirements, but they're not where they normally sit at the moment. So we need to take a really, really hard-nosed view and say, is it essential for a pilot to be able to see or not? Can we enroll someone in a course who's deaf or not? A lot of the things that we have as restrictions at the moment will fall away, or we will leave it up to some employing agency to decide, well, you've got this degree that enables you to teach, but because we're going to use you in a situation which is going to be unsafe for a blind person to be in the classroom, then we won't employ you. But that's a different level of issue than us as educators making available programs for people to pursue their desires and their goals and who may well be able to get, employment that's quite suitable.
Molly, you come to the point of inherent requirements, which is exactly what I was thinking when Dave was speaking. Dave, I've got very similar example from medicine where a student with a disability was not allowed to do the course because the inherent requirements said that they had to be a generalist. The course medicine, you graduate a generalist who works in a hospital, who does certain things, but this person really wanted to specialize in a way that would enable them to actually be in that specialty, and yet they were still not allowed to be to do the course. And so I do think we do need to look at inherent requirements, and Ben Whitburn and Tim Corcoran had done some work here at Deakin actually that looks at how we might put in more equitable lens towards inherent requirements that I think is really good. Sally, we've got a question for you on the Q&A relating. Wait, sorry, I just need to actually see it. Relating to experiences of the AQF review, how easy or hard is the task of embedding inclusion in system-wide policy reforms? What insights can you share that might inform more effective engagement in the accord process?
The AQF reform process has been quite scarring. We're sort of trying to resurrect it, and that was big scale reform. That's been, and I think one of you made the point, Rola, I think you made the point, that's been undermined by political, I won't say imperatives because I think that would over-aggrandise what's happening, but certainly from the vocational education and training sector, resistance to big change, even if it's much needed change. So it's a bit like Dave's response, I think, chip away, and that's what Megan, Lily, and I from the AI group are trying to do with AQF reform. So chip away, find people that are interested, go for the bits that you think might be most attractive. The AQF reform, now that you've given me that entree into it, will actually change the way that we now privilege knowledge and suggest that skills complexity is equally as worthy of attainment as knowledge complexity, and that the two don't rise in lockstep, which is what the idea of unlocking skills is about. But we also, and this might be more relevant here, unlock application, because application doesn't rise in lockstep over 10 levels. And the obvious example that Peter Noonan used to delight in giving against my own discipline was that lawyers have to do 3 or 4 years at AQF, very variously 7, 8 or 9, then have to go and do an AQF level 8 practical legal training course for accreditation requirement, then get admitted to practice and have approximately 18 to 24 months of supervised practice. So the autonomy in the application sphere is not linked is linked in that way. When air traffic controllers, because we were talking about them, can do as diploma level 5 and immediately go out and start hopefully not crashing planes into each other in very autonomous application. So the point of that would be there is the potential under the AQF reform to try and explicate, certainly under the description of the qualification, what the inherent requirements might be or what the application might be, and for inclusion, and to articulate under application the assessment conditions in which the qualification was conducted or delivered, as well as the opportunities for authentic practice in that regard. So it's tangential, but I'm grateful for the opportunity, and it's been a long, slow process. So patient capital is the other thing you need to build, and don't lose patience.
Thanks, Sally. Any other questions, folks? If you want, sorry, I'm on mute. Any other questions coming through? I think people are sharing some resources in the chat. I mean, one of the challenges that I have in working in this space is the need to, we do need to look at, for example, specific categories of students. So for example, we do need to know data about particular equity students, and we do need to have data about students with disability, etc. But at the same time, not using labels, because we are all diverse and we all bring different things, and it's not necessarily to do with the label either. Like, we might have things that affect our ability to learn and study, engage at university properly, that aren't necessarily linked to the label. And for me, that's always a tension in the way I think about inclusion and diversity. I don't know how others conceptualize this, Dave.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of tyranny of the equity categories. They came in for very good reason. It means because it was an equity category, we had to do something about it. We had to notice it, we had to measure it, we had to kind of see how many people were there, see how they were progressing and so on. So in terms of running a system, they drew attention to a particular issue and focused on it. But what this book is about saying, well, there are named equity categories, and almost every year there's a new one added to that list. Whether it's in legislation or not is another matter. So the list of those categories that we had read out earlier is getting longer and longer and longer. So I think in practical terms, we still need to do the monitoring, of course, so those categories are useful for that. But in terms of designing equitable assessment, then we need to, in a sense, set those aside and not focus on the categories, except insofar as we need to test our designs, our redesigns, in terms of whether it will work for all sorts of different examples. So I think we need to design across categories. So we need to be category blind and only use them as a kind of a checklist rather than something which is driving our whole way of doing things.
Any other thoughts, Sally? Did I see your hand up at some point?
No, I think I would just agree with that. I think that's sort of with respect, and I'm probably going to mangle it, but it's a bit like universal design. You try to clear the path for everyone, but there will always need to be a safety net to catch and support students. But what we do well in clearing the path for equity group students has always resonated and paid dividends for all students. So I think Dave's right. It's that the diversity is endemic, I think, is the point. We have 6 equity group categories that have served us well. There are a number of other categories, and the first in family. So I shared with you the 50% of students belong to at least one equity category, 1 in 10 belong in more than one category and suffer with compounding disadvantage, 51% are first in their family to attend university. I mean, when you sit back and think about that, and that we're still applying quite traditional assessment approaches without necessarily assuring the delivery and the development of assessment and feedback literacies for those students so that they can play in the higher education assessment game. There is something rudely wrong with what we're currently doing, which someone should take some interest in in the regulatory way. And I know regulation shouldn't drive what needs to happen, but in some respects, I mean, especially when there's legislative requirements around many of these things, perhaps it should.
Thanks, Sally. I'm going to take one final question on the Q&A, and I think then maybe we'll draw to a close. And anyone can answer this, really. Does the focus on students and their diversity involved in inclusive practice disrupt the traditional role of the educator or assessor as the expert with control over all aspects of assessment, including what is assessed and how? Is that contributing to the resistance to change? Dave, yes, I thought you might.
Well, the answer is no, but there's a bit of yes there as well. And the no part is we're not fundamentally changing the role of the educator as having expertise in the subject matter, having expertise in assessment. However, where they're no longer an expert, we can't leave it to them. So if they can demonstrate their expertise in inclusive assessment design, there's not an issue. But if we come along and we look at their assessment practice and we discover that it doesn't reflect expertise in inclusive design, then the answer is yes. We are calling that into question. So we're all professionals as teachers in higher education, but it doesn't mean to say our professionalism shouldn't be questioned. In any profession, if one of our colleagues is doing something which is off, then we have a responsibility, a collective responsibility to call it out. And that's what we need to be doing. We're not stigmatizing those people. We're saying, well, hang on, well, you need a bit more development here before we can let you loose on doing things. So yes, they still maintain their key positional role, but we don't give them open slather.
Liz.
I think the resistance to change in this space seems to me to reflect a lot of the resistance to change to assessment more generally and to curriculum change more generally. One of the continuing problems that comes back again and again and again is the balance between working at scale and personalising assessment in this case. So, and that's a balance, and it's about what effort and what capability you can invest in those two counterbalancing pieces. Scale makes us sustainable, personalisation makes us responsive and allows individuals to succeed. And that balance will be struck differently in different institutions and by different groups of academics. But I think the important thing is to interrogate it, to get in there and say, well, what exactly, if I'm putting everybody through the same assessment hoops, and I love that cartoon of the hoop actually, Rola, if I'm throwing everybody through the same hoop, am I just doing it because I really have to, I've only got one hoop, or am I doing it because I can only imagine one hoop, or I've only got one hoop in my hand at the time? You know, are there other ways that you can come at this which allow other forms of personalisation? And I think there are great ideas out there if we just give people a chance to find them.
Thanks, Liz. That's a really good reminder of one of the principles around ethical reflexivity and really thinking through critically what it is that we're trying to do, and not just in the task itself, but to look at the assessment processes more broadly and our relationships with students, which are really important to anything we do in this endeavour. Sorry, I'm just reading your message there, Sally. The othering of, do you want to say something about that, Sally?
Well, no, I had a section and then I had to take it out because too many words. But I did, you know, when I think about a piece of work that came, and it may not be a very empirically sound piece of work, but it was one piece of work that came out of the COVID experience, which was that 43%, I think, of students over COVID felt like imposters. And I don't know whether it was exactly an artifact of COVID or was a broader artifact about feeling like they're imposters in their own degrees, and this is not something that I can do, and this is not, you know, I'm not supposed to be here. You know, and if our assessment reinforces that, and particularly, you know, the equity group students who would struggle potentially to feel a sense of belonging, and again, some great National Centre for Student Equity and Higher Education work showed that over COVID, equity group students felt very othered and quite marginalised, and that was exacerbated. And other, you know, and it's all variable; it all depends on different cohorts, but it does make me think that if assessment is where the educational and student experience the rubber hits the road, and students are making harsh judgments about whether they are imposters or do belong or feel like this is not for them because they're not up to it, and it's assessment that causes them harm essentially and puts them out. Then that is an ethical and moral imperative to do something better about that. And the accommodation model that is in the chapter there that I refer to in the chat always seemed to me to be quite ad hoc and quite resistant, and really done on a case-by-case basis with no sense of quality or assurance and requiring students to again and again repeat what it was that they needed to get the adjustments that were legislatively in many instances required. We just have to do better. It's true.
Yeah, and I think just reflecting on all the students we have talked to across the projects we've done, students aren't out there to cheat the system in the way that we always suspect that they're going to cheat the system. They want to be able to demonstrate that they can meet the learning outcomes. They want to graduate from university and say, yes, I have met, I can do this job and I'm prepared for, my future life in the ways that the university has prepared me for. They want to be able to do the things that are important to them. And so it really is about trying to see the issues that we've created in perhaps assessments that don't actually support them to do those things, assessments that are no longer fit for the world that we live in, and to take some of that and consider how we can support our students to actually do the things that they want to do. They're all pretty reasonable about their capabilities and they all know what their goals are, what they're doing with this university degree. So just thinking about what Sally was saying about, not feeling like they belong and having that imposter syndrome, that they have a want and a need to feel that they are doing the right things and they are getting to where they want to go. So we should be helping them do those things.
Oh, Jo, what a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for that, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure and I've learned a lot actually from this conversation and just thinking through what next steps might be around assessment and how we might actually practically do things in along these different layers to actually effect change. Watch this space. There's a CRADLE suggests coming out around assessment for inclusion that has some real practical ways forward that we suggest that draw on some of the principles we've talked about and a lot of the issues we've shared. And I think, at least for me, but I think with everyone in the room, this is really the start of a really important conversation and a lot more work in this space to really put equity first around assessment design and lift assessment and the quality of assessment across the board for all students. So thank you all so much. The recordings will be available and we'll hopefully see you at the next one. Thanks, everyone.